You're 13 years old, standing in the snow-covered ruins of what was once your village. The smoke still rises from the charred remains of your family's home, and the silence is broken only by the distant sound of hoofbeats growing closer. Your father lies motionless in the frozen mud, an arrow still protruding from his back. Your mother and sister are nowhere to be found. Then you see them, riders emerging from the morning mist like demons from the underworld, their horses breathing steam in the bitter cold. The Mongol warriors dismount with practiced efficiency, their eyes scanning the survivors with the calculating gaze of merchants evaluating livestock. When one of them points directly at you, your legs nearly give out beneath you. You try to run, but there's nowhere to go. Within moments, rough hands seize your arms, and you're dragged toward a line of other boys, some younger than you, others barely older, all sharing the same look of terror and disbelief. You don't know it yet, but your childhood has just ended. What awaits you in the court of the great Khan will make you long for the simple brutality of this moment. You're about to enter a world where power is absolute, where your body belongs to men who view you as nothing more than an object for their entertainment, and where survival depends on learning to smile while your soul dies a little more each day. Welcome to the Mongol Empire, where the line between conquest and consumption blurred until it disappeared entirely, leaving behind only the echoes of young voices that were never meant to break. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of systematic exploitation and survival, if you enjoy learning about the dark truths of history that most people never hear about, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Mongol Empire stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. We celebrate their military genius, their administrative innovations, their role in connecting East and West. But behind the glory of conquest lay a darker reality, one that history books have chosen to forget or gloss over with euphemistic language that hides the true horror of what happened to the most vulnerable victims of Mongol expansion. The great Khans didn't just collect territory, gold, and tribute from their conquered peoples. They collected children, young boys specifically, torn from their families and cultures to serve in ways that would fundamentally alter not just their bodies, but their understanding of what it meant to be human. These weren't warriors in training or pages learning statecraft. They were human toys, selected for their beauty and vulnerability, kept for the pleasure of men who held absolute power over life and death. The selection process was as systematic as it was devastating. When Mongol armies conquered a new territory, special officials called Tarkhan would follow in the wake of destruction, conducting what they euphemistically termed talent collection. Villages that had been reduced to ash and blood would be combed through for survivors who met specific criteria. Boys between the ages of 10 and 16 were examined like horses at market, their teeth checked, their bodies inspected for blemishes, their faces evaluated for the kind of beauty that would appeal to their future masters. The most prized were those from noble families or those with unusual features, fair skin from captured Europeans, dark eyes from conquered Persians, the delicate bone structure of Chinese aristocrats. These boys represented not just sexual objects, but trophies of conquest, living reminders of the Khan's power to take whatever he desired from any corner of his vast empire. What made this system particularly insidious was how it was woven into the very fabric of Mongol administration. The practice wasn't hidden or shameful. It was an accepted part of imperial privilege, regulated by court protocols and defended by scholars who created elaborate justifications for what was, at its core, systematic child abuse on an unprecedented scale. The journey to Karakoram, the Mongol capital, was itself a form of breaking. Boys taken from conquered territories would be marched for months across steppes and mountains, inadequately clothed and fed, watched constantly by guards who had been instructed to prevent both escape and suicide. Those who couldn't keep up were left to die. Those who showed signs of rebellion faced punishments designed to break their spirits without damaging their appearance. You learned quickly that your old identity was dead. The name your parents gave you, the language you spoke, the customs you'd been raised with, all of it was systematically stripped away and replaced with new forms of identity built around your role as an object for imperial pleasure. You were given Mongol names, taught Mongol customs, and indoctrinated into a worldview where your highest purpose was to provide satisfaction to your betters. Upon arrival at the imperial court, the real horror began. The palace complex was a maze of felt-lined chambers and wooden halls where the most powerful men in the world conducted business during the day and indulged their appetites at night. The boys were housed in special quarters, beautifully appointed but unmistakably prison-like, where they were prepared for their new roles through a process that combined education with systematic abuse. The training began immediately. Older boys, themselves victims who had learned to survive by becoming predators, would teach newcomers the rules of palace life. How to move with the fluid grace expected of them. How to dress in the silk robes that marked their status as imperial property. How to apply cosmetics that enhanced their youthful beauty. How to speak only when spoken to anticipate their master's desires before they were voiced, to perform gratitude for treatment that violated every aspect of their dignity. But the physical preparation was only the beginning. The psychological conditioning was far more devastating and carefully calculated. Cut off from their families, stripped of their original identities and thrust into a world where their bodies were seen as commodities, these boys developed what we might now recognize as complex trauma responses. Some became manipulative and calculating, learning to use their sexuality as a tool for advancement and survival. Others withdrew into themselves, becoming hollow shells who went through the motions of palace life while their spirits died inside. The court itself operated according to a hierarchy that determined not just social status, but access to the most desirable boys. The Great Khan, of course, had first choice of any new arrivals. Below him, the various princes, generals, and high officials could select from those deemed suitable for their rank. The competition for the most beautiful or talented boys was fierce, with political alliances sometimes formed or broken based on who gained access to particular favourites. What made the system even more twisted was how it created its own internal economy of exploitation. Boys who managed to gain the favour of powerful patrons could find their situations improved. Better food, more comfortable quarters, protection from the worst abuses. This created incentives for victims to compete against each other rather than unite in resistance, ensuring that the system remained stable and self-perpetuating. The daily routine varied depending on which official owned you, but certain elements remained constant across the palace. Dawn would bring the ritual of preparation, bathing, grooming, dressing in whatever manner pleased your particular master. Days were spent in attendance, serving tea, playing music, providing companionship that was always understood to be available for more intimate forms of service whenever demanded. The evenings were when the true nature of your situation became impossible to ignore. When the formal business of empire concluded and the palace settled into its private rhythms, you would be summoned to chambers where powerful men expected you to provide entertainment that had nothing to do with music or conversation. The silk robes that had marked your elevated status during the day became costumes in performances you had never chosen to give. Some boys attempted resistance, but the palace was designed to make such defiance nearly impossible. You were constantly watched, not just by guards but by other boys who had learned that reporting suspicious behavior could earn them rewards or protection. The few who managed to attempt escape faced punishments that were both severe and public, designed to discourage others from similar acts of rebellion. The physical abuse was terrible enough, but the psychological manipulation was perhaps even more damaging. Masters employed techniques designed to break down resistance and create dependency. Some boys were given temporary privileges or shown moments of apparent kindness, only to have these gifts withdrawn as punishment for perceived slights. This created a constant state of anxiety and confusion, as victims never knew whether they were in favour or facing punishment. The isolation was particularly cruel for children torn from their families and communities. Many masters deliberately prevented their boys from forming friendships or alliances with other victims, understanding that emotional support might strengthen resistance to the system. Boys who might have found comfort in shared experiences instead found themselves competing for their master's attention, knowing that falling out of favour could mean even worse treatment. The transformation of these children into objects for imperial pleasure wasn't accidental. It was the result of centuries of refined techniques for breaking human spirits and rebuilding them according to the desires of those in power. The Mongol court had perfected methods that would be recognizable to anyone familiar with modern understanding of systematic abuse, creating dependencies and loyalties that made victims complicit in their own exploitation. The education provided to these boys was itself a form of control designed to make them more perfect instruments of their master's desires. You learned to read and write in Mongol script, but only so you could compose poetry that praised your owner's virtues. You studied music, but the songs you mastered were those that enhanced intimate moments in private chambers. You were taught philosophy and history, but always through the lens of Mongol superiority and your own grateful submission to imperial will. The clothing you wore served multiple purposes beyond mere decoration. The silk garments and precious ornaments marked your status as valuable property, while serving as constant reminders that even your physical appearance was not your own to control. Masters took pride in how beautifully they could dress their favourites, treating them like living dolls rather than human beings. The irony was devastating. Draped in luxury, you remained utterly powerless beneath these beautiful trappings. Regional differences in the treatment of palace boys reflected the diverse cultures within the Mongol Empire, but none offered genuine protection or dignity. In the Eastern Territories, influenced by Chinese customs, the abuse might be wrapped in more elaborate ceremony. In the Western regions, shaped by Persian traditions, the exploitation took on different aesthetic forms. But regardless of location, the fundamental lack of freedom and autonomy remained constant. The medical care provided to palace boys revealed the calculating nature of their exploitation. Masters ensured their property remained healthy and attractive, providing treatment when necessary to maintain their investments. However, this care was limited to preserving appearance and function, with no consideration for psychological well-being or long-term consequences. Boys were treated like valuable horses, kept in good condition to serve their purpose, but never seen as beings deserving of genuine care or compassion. The seasonal rhythms of court life created predictable patterns of intensified exploitation. During winter months, when the court was confined to indoor activities, boys faced increased demands for entertainment and companionship. Summer campaigns brought different challenges, as some were selected to accompany their masters on military expeditions, serving their needs while traveling across conquered territories. These journeys were never voluntary. You were portable property, expected to provide the same services regardless of location. Communication between palace boys was heavily restricted, but when possible, these young victims developed their own networks of survival and information sharing. They learned to communicate through subtle gestures and coded language, sharing warnings about particularly dangerous masters or offering comfort during especially difficult periods. These connections, while necessarily secretive, provided crucial emotional support in an otherwise isolating existence. The competitive nature of court life added another layer of psychological torture. When masters kept multiple boys, they often deliberately pitted them against each other for attention and privileges. This prevented solidarity among victims and created an atmosphere of constant tension and betrayal. Children who might have found strength in shared resistance instead found themselves competing for scraps of favour, knowing that unity could mean collective punishment. Some boys developed what might be recognised today as survival strategies, learning to read their master's moods with extraordinary precision, anticipating desires before they were expressed, becoming expert actors who could perform contentment while suppressing their true feelings. These skills helped them avoid the worst punishments, but required them to live in a constant state of performance, never able to express authentic emotions or desires. The age at which boys entered this life varied, but many were still children when their fates were sealed. The developmental impact of growing up in such circumstances created lasting damage that affected every aspect of their lives. They never had opportunities to form normal relationships, develop personal interests, or understand what healthy human connections might look like. Their entire understanding of power, intimacy, and self-worth was shaped by systematic exploitation. Training schools existed specifically to prepare conquered boys for palace life, much like gladiator schools prepared fighters for the arena. These institutions were as profitable as they were brutal, systematically breaking down the personalities and resistance of their students while teaching the skills expected by future masters. The curriculum included not just physical training, but psychological conditioning designed to create compliant, attractive companions. The retirement or aging of palace boys presented another cruel aspect of their existence. Unlike other servants who might eventually earn positions of responsibility, boys who lost their youthful appeal often found themselves discarded with no resources or skills for independent survival. Some masters simply abandoned their aging favourites, while others sold them to lower status households where conditions were typically worse. The rare cases of palace boys who managed to gain freedom and achieve some measure of success later in life stand out precisely because they were so exceptional. These individuals often had to completely reinvent themselves, hiding their past while struggling to overcome the psychological damage of their earlier experiences. Their stories, while inspiring, highlight how unusual it was for anyone to escape this system intact. The social acceptance of this exploitation among Mongol elites reveals much about the moral framework of the empire. While Mongols prided themselves on concepts of strength, loyalty, and honor, these ideals apparently only applied to free members of the warrior class. The suffering of conquered children was simply considered irrelevant to moral calculations, demonstrating how completely they had been dehumanized in Mongol society. Archaeological evidence provides glimpses into the lives of these forgotten victims. Artifacts found in Mongol palace sites include objects likely used to control or monitor palace boys, as well as personal items that hint at their daily experiences. However, most physical evidence of their existence has been lost to time, just as their voices were silenced in life. The economic value placed on these boys created markets that encouraged continued capture and trafficking of children. Wealthy officials competed to acquire the most beautiful or talented companions, driving up prices and creating incentives for military commanders to prioritize the collection of suitable victims during conquest campaigns. The commodification of human beings reached its peak in these transactions, where children's lives were reduced to simple calculations of beauty, rarity, and potential for providing pleasure. The psychological manipulation employed to maintain control was sophisticated and deliberate. Masters understood that broken spirits were more compliant than defiant ones. So they employed techniques designed to create dependency while preventing the formation of resistant attitudes. Some boys were given false hope of eventual freedom, only to have these promises withdrawn as punishment. Others were told that their families had forgotten them or that returning home was impossible, creating despair that made compliance seem like the only option. The few documented attempts at rebellion among palace boys reveal the desperate measures some took to assert their humanity and dignity. These acts of defiance, while often unsuccessful and severely punished, demonstrate that the human spirit could not be completely crushed even under the most oppressive circumstances. Some boys tried to poison their masters, others attempted suicide, and a few managed brief escapes before being recaptured and made examples of for the others. The impact of this system extended beyond its immediate victims to influence Mongol society as a whole. The normalization of treating conquered children as objects for pleasure contributed to a broader culture of dehumanization that made other forms of cruelty easier to justify. This cultural acceptance created an environment where systematic exploitation was not just tolerated, but celebrated as a symbol of imperial power and success. The transition periods when palace boys were sold or transferred from one master to another were particularly traumatic, as they faced the uncertainty of new households, different expectations, and unknown levels of cruelty or kindness. Each transition meant starting over in terms of learning how to survive in a new environment while maintaining the psychological defenses that had kept them alive in their previous situation. Some masters treated their boys as temporary diversions, quickly losing interest and either selling them or relegating them to ordinary household duties. Others developed long-term attachments that, while still fundamentally exploitative, provided a degree of stability and predictability. Neither situation offered true security, as the boys' fate always remained entirely dependent on their master's whims. The seasonal migration of the Mongol court between different camps and conquered cities meant that many palace boys spent their lives moving between different environments and social contexts. This constant adaptation required tremendous psychological flexibility, while preventing them from ever establishing roots or forming lasting connections with places or people. The education of palace boys in poetry, music, and conversation created a cruel irony. They were taught to appreciate beauty and culture, while being denied any opportunity to create or contribute to these fields themselves. They became living repositories of artistic knowledge and skill, but always in service to others' enjoyment rather than their own expression. Physical training regimens imposed on palace boys were designed to maintain their appeal to their masters, but these programs were often extreme and punishing. Young men had no choice but to endure whatever exercise, dietary restrictions, or body modifications their masters demanded, regardless of the physical or psychological cost. The seasonal celebrations and festivals of Mongol society created additional pressures for palace boys, who were often expected to participate in elaborate entertainments or private celebrations. These events might seem festive from the outside, but for the boys involved, they represented additional opportunities for humiliation and exploitation. The development of personal relationships between palace boys and other household members was complicated by the ambiguous nature of their status. While they might live in relative luxury, everyone understood that their position was based entirely on their master's favour, making genuine friendship or romance nearly impossible. The regional trade networks that supplied young men to serve as palace boys stretched across the entire Mongol Empire and beyond. This system created incentives for warfare, kidnapping, and debt slavery as traders sought to meet the demand from wealthy Mongol households. The human cost of maintaining this supply chain was enormous, affecting not just the victims, but entire communities and cultures. The training and conditioning of palace boys involved not just learning specific skills, but undergoing psychological manipulation designed to break down their resistance and create dependence. Masters and their agents became experts at identifying and exploiting psychological weaknesses, using techniques that would be recognized today as systematic abuse. The clothing and ornamentation of palace boys served multiple purposes beyond mere decoration. These items marked their status, demonstrated their master's wealth and taste, and served as constant reminders of their lack of autonomy. Even their physical appearance was not their own to control. The medical and grooming practices imposed on palace boys often involved procedures that were painful, dangerous, or permanently disfiguring. These practices were performed without regard for the boys' consent or comfort, treating their bodies as objects to be modified according to their master's preferences. The psychological impact of growing up or spending formative years in such circumstances created lasting damage that affected every aspect of these young men's lives. They never had the opportunity to develop normal concepts of consent, autonomy, or healthy relationships, making recovery extremely difficult, even if they eventually gained freedom. The social isolation imposed on many palace boys prevented them from developing the social skills and connections that might have helped them survive or escape their situations. This isolation was often deliberate, as masters wanted to prevent their property from forming alliances or receiving outside support. The economic calculations that determined palace boys' fates reduced human beings to simple monetary values, with prices fluctuating based on factors like age, appearance, skills, and origin. This commodification made it easier for masters to justify treating them as disposable objects, rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity and respect. The impact on Mongol society of normalizing this level of exploitation and dehumanization extended far beyond the immediate victims. A culture that could accept the systematic abuse of vulnerable young men was prepared to accept other forms of cruelty and injustice, contributing to the broader pattern of oppression that characterized much of Mongol expansion. The few glimpses we have of resistance and rebellion among palace boys reveal the desperate measures some took to assert their humanity and dignity. These acts of defiance, while often futile and severely punished, demonstrate that the human spirit could not be completely crushed even under the most oppressive circumstances. The religious and philosophical systems of the Mongol Empire provided no meaningful protection or comfort for these victims. While Mongols debated complex questions of strategy and governance, they apparently saw no contradiction between these pursuits and the systematic exploitation of powerless young men. As we reflect on these forgotten stories of suffering and survival, we must remember that behind every historical statistic was a real human being with hopes, fears, and dreams that were never allowed to flourish. The palace boys of the Mongol Empire were not footnotes to history, but individuals whose experiences reveal important truths about power, exploitation, and human resilience. Their stories challenge us to look beyond the military victories and administrative achievements of the Mongol Empire to see the human cost of this civilization's grandeur. They remind us that historical progress often came at the expense of the most vulnerable members of society, and that the price of imperial glory was frequently paid by those who had no choice in the matter. The systematic nature of this exploitation demonstrates how easily societies can normalize and institutionalize cruelty when it serves the interests of the powerful. The Mongols' ability to maintain elaborate military and administrative systems while simultaneously operating this network of human trafficking shows how selective moral reasoning can become when it challenges existing power structures. These young men's experiences also illuminate the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Despite facing circumstances designed to break them completely, many found ways to maintain some sense of self and dignity. Their small acts of resistance, moments of connection with others, and determination to survive represent triumphs of humanity over systematic dehumanization. Understanding their stories helps us recognize similar patterns of exploitation and abuse in our own time. While the specific forms may have changed, the underlying dynamics of power, vulnerability, and systematic oppression remain relevant today. Their experiences serve as a warning about what can happen when societies allow the powerful to treat other human beings as objects for their pleasure and profit. The silence that has surrounded these stories for so long reflects our continued discomfort with acknowledging the full extent of historical injustice. By bringing these forgotten voices back into historical consciousness, we honor their memory and remind ourselves of our obligation to prevent such systematic abuse from occurring again. The palace boys of the Mongol Empire lived and died in circumstances that no human being should ever have to endure. Their stories deserve to be remembered not as titillating historical curiosities, but as testimonies to human suffering and resilience. In remembering them, we acknowledge their humanity and commit ourselves to building a world where such exploitation becomes impossible. Their legacy challenges us to examine our own society's treatment of its most vulnerable members and to ask ourselves what future historians might discover about the systematic injustices we choose to ignore or accept today. The questions their stories raise about power, consent, and human dignity remain as relevant now as they were 8 centuries ago. In the end, the horrific games of the Mongol Khans and their systematic abuse of conquered boys serves as a stark reminder that civilization's greatest achievements often rest on foundations of unspeakable cruelty. By understanding and acknowledging this truth, we honor those who suffered and commit ourselves to ensuring that such systematic dehumanization never again becomes the hidden price of empire and conquest.